An ordinary day turned into a nightmare. A police officer stopped a girl on the street and broke her arm. He had no idea who her mother was. Subscribe so you don't miss any new stories, and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The small California town rested in the gentle light of an early afternoon. The sun poured its warmth over the rooftops, painting the sidewalks in long golden strips that shimmered between patches of shade cast by carefully planted maples. A breeze carried the faint scent of freshly cut grass from a neighbor's lawn, mingling with the sweetness of blooming jasmine that spilled over a nearby fence. The air was calm, so ordinary that no one walking through the neighborhood would have expected anything to happen, let alone something that would ripple across an entire community. It was in this quiet that La Kea, a slender 6-year-old girl with boundless curiosity and an imagination that filled entire sketchbooks, made her way home from school. Her bright backpack, decorated with stickers from cartoons and superheroes, bounced gently with each step she took. Inside, notebooks leaned against a worn folder, and at the very bottom, carefully wrapped in a sleeve of construction paper, lay her latest drawing. La Kea was proud of it. She had spent most of the afternoon sketching her classmates in art class, trying to capture their laughter, their gestures, the way their hair flew when they ran. Her teacher had praised her work, and she was eager to show it to her mother. The thought of Ronda's smile, of the way her mother would crouch down to her level and study every detail with genuine admiration, filled the child's chest with warmth. The girl's other hand clutched a small apple, still cold from her lunchbox, which she had saved to enjoy on the walk home. The fruit's red skin caught the light as though it had been polished. She walked along the familiar sidewalk, passing the tall hedges that always smelled faintly of pine, the mailbox leaning slightly to the left in front of the Johnson's house, and the old wooden swing tied to the branch of a sprawling oak. These details were part of her daily journey, signposts that made her feel secure, that told her she was almost home. Only 2 blocks remained, and she could already picture the moment she would throw her arms around her mother, place the drawing into her hands, and wait for the praise she knew would come. La Kea wasn't the kind of child to cause trouble. She wasn't loud, nor was she careless. Even at her young age, she had been taught discipline, though not the harsh kind that demanded obedience for its own sake. Her mother's discipline was patient, rooted in the lessons of sportsmanship, resilience, and respect. Ronda Rousey, who had once stood on the podium of the Olympics and later ruled the MMA octagon, had transferred her values into the everyday lives of her family. She had told La Kea that strength was not about hurting, but about protecting, not about showing off, but about standing firm when the world tried to push you down. And so La Kea walked home quietly, neither laughing nor shouting, just a little girl navigating the end of an ordinary school day with a sketch pad under one arm and an apple in her hand. The street was unusually empty. Sometimes children would still be playing tag on the sidewalks, or a neighbor would be trimming their rose bushes. But today the silence pressed in gently, almost like a blanket. The quiet was broken only by the distant hum of a lawnmower and the occasional bark of a dog behind a fence. La Kea hummed softly to herself, a tune she remembered from a cartoon, and let the rhythm of her steps fall into sync with her song. She was so absorbed in her own thoughts that she didn't immediately notice the car that had slowed to match her pace. The sound of an engine rumbling low reached her ears. At first, she assumed it was just a neighbor pulling into a driveway. But when the vehicle didn't pass her, she turned her head slightly. A black and white police cruiser crawled alongside her, its glossy paint reflecting the sunlight, its tires crunching softly against the gravel at the road's edge. The driver's side window rolled down with a mechanical hum, and a man's face appeared. He wore dark sunglasses, which slid slightly down the bridge of his nose as he leaned out. His jaw was square, his expression unreadable, but tinged with something that unsettled her. "You lost, sweetheart?" he asked. The words were smooth, almost casual, but the undertone carried a weight that didn't sound like kindness. La Kea slowed her steps, glancing nervously toward her house only a few blocks away. She shook her head politely, just as her mother had taught her to respond to adults with respect. "No, sir," she said softly. "I live right there." She pointed down the street, her small finger trembling slightly as though unsure whether to indicate the exact house. The officer's lips tightened. His sunglasses slipped a little further, revealing pale eyes that studied her like she was more than just a passing child. "ID?" he demanded, the sudden sharpness in his tone startling her. She blinked, confusion flooding her expression. "I'm 9, she replied. "I don't have ID." The officer pushed open the door of the cruiser. The heavy slam of his boots on the pavement echoed too loudly in the quiet street. Lakia's heart thudded in her chest, though she couldn't understand why. She clutched her drawing tighter under her arm, her apple pressing harder against her palm. "Where's your parent?" he asked, stepping closer. "At home," she said quickly, nervously. "I just left art class." "Don't get smart," he snapped, his voice sharp as a whip. Lakia froze. She hadn't meant to be disrespectful. She had only answered. But before she could explain further, he reached out and grabbed her wrist suddenly. The pressure was rough, not guiding but claiming, not steady but aggressive. She gasped in pain, instinctively trying to pull away. The sketch pad slipped from under her arm and hit the ground, its pages spilling across the sidewalk. The apple rolled into the gutter, wobbling before it settled against the curb. Her small body twisted as he forced her wrist behind her back. "You've got a smart mouth for a little brat," he muttered, his voice low but laced with anger. Lakia whimpered, trying to form words, but the pain silenced her. She could feel the strength in his grip, unrelenting, as if she were no more than an object to be controlled. Then came the crack. It was sharp, unmistakable, and cruel. The bone gave way under the force, and Lakia screamed. Her voice split the air, louder than anything the quiet neighborhood had held moments before. She collapsed to the ground, clutching at her arm, sobbing in shock and agony. Her body trembled against the unforgiving pavement, and the once ordinary day shattered into chaos. The officer stood over her, breathing heavily. His chest rose and fell as though he had accomplished something, as though this was a lesson to be taught. "That's what happens when you don't listen," he growled, reaching toward his belt as though to pull out handcuffs. But then he hesitated, scanning the empty street. No witnesses, no one to see. His face tightened, and instead of following through, he turned sharply back to his cruiser. The car door slammed, the engine roared, and the vehicle pulled away, leaving the child sprawled on the sidewalk, sobbing and broken. Lakia's vision blurred with tears. The pain in her arm pulsed like fire, each heartbeat sending another wave through her body. She wanted to call for her mother, but the words wouldn't come. She remembered, though, the lesson Ronda had drilled into her, not with fear, but with careful insistence. If something happens, if you're ever in danger, press and hold. Don't think, just press and hold. Her trembling fingers fumbled with her phone, slick with sweat. She pressed the button as she had been taught. A sound confirmed the call had connected. She didn't speak. She couldn't. But the line was open, and on the other end, far away in a gym that smelled of leather and sweat, Ronda Rousey heard her daughter's cries. In that moment, everything changed. The peaceful day was gone. The first shadow had fallen, and it would not pass quietly. The cry of the little girl still echoed along the street long after the cruiser's taillights had disappeared around the corner. The sound hung in the air, sharp and jagged, as if it had carved itself into the stillness of the neighborhood. Lakia lay curled on the pavement, her small frame shaking, her injured arm bent unnaturally. Tears streaked her cheeks, mixing with the dust that clung to her skin. Every breath came in short, jagged gasps, and the world around her blurred into a haze of pain and confusion. The sketch pad she had carried so proudly only minutes ago now lay open on the sidewalk, its pages splayed like broken wings, smudged with dirt and a faint trace of her blood from where her scraped elbow pressed against the paper. The apple she had saved so carefully for her walk rolled until it hit the gutter, where it rested against a discarded soda can, its bright red skin now dulled and bruised. The once ordinary street had turned into a scene of cruelty, where innocence collided with authority in its ugliest form. For Lakia, the world seemed to have shifted, tilting violently into something unfamiliar and terrifying. She was not supposed to be here, on the ground, clutching her arm that throbbed with white-hot pain. She was supposed to be walking home to her mother, showing her the drawing, biting into the crisp sweetness of her apple. Instead, the pavement beneath her felt cold, and the sky overhead felt too far away. She tried to sit up, but the wave of pain that surged through her body made her cry out again. Her voice cracked, thin and desperate, but no one answered. The houses around her stood silent, their curtains drawn. The few cars parked along the curb remained empty. She was alone, and the silence pressed in like a weight heavier than her small body could bear. Her thoughts spiraled into panic. What if he came back? What if no one found her? The fear clutched at her chest, as sharp and suffocating as the pain in her arm. Then through the fog of terror she remembered. Her mother's voice calm and steady, teaching her what to do if something ever went wrong. The memory surfaced as if from a deep pool. Ronda kneeling down, her hands on Laakia's small shoulders, looking her in the eyes with a seriousness that was rare in their usually playful interactions. If you're ever in trouble, don't waste time talking. Don't wait. Just press and hold. The phone will do the rest. I'll hear you, no matter what. Her good hand fumbled for the phone that had slipped halfway out of her backpack when it hit the ground. Her fingers trembled as she grasped it, slick with sweat, slippery with panic. For a moment she thought she would drop it, and despair threatened to overwhelm her. But she held on, pressing the button as she had been taught. The screen lit up faintly, and the sound of a connection filled the air. She didn't need to speak. She couldn't. But the line was alive, and on the other end of that invisible thread was her mother. Ronda was across town in the gym, her fists pounding rhythmically into the heavy bag. The thud of leather against leather, the controlled breathing, the deep focus. These were the sounds of discipline, of control honed over decades. She was lost in the familiar rhythm when the phone in her bag vibrated. At first, she almost ignored it, assuming it was just another message or call that could wait. But when she pulled it free and saw the name that flashed on the screen, Laakia, the world shifted. She answered instantly, bringing the phone to her ear, but no words came through, only sound, ragged breathing, a whimper, then a scream that pierced the air like nothing Ronda had ever heard before. It wasn't the cry of a scraped knee or a childhood fall. It was the scream of real pain, raw and primal, followed by a sound that made her blood run cold. The unmistakable snap of bone. Ronda froze, her hand clenched around the phone, her knuckles white. For a moment she couldn't breathe. But then the flood of instinct surged forward, every fiber of her being turning sharp and focused. Her world narrowed into one goal, her daughter. She didn't shout, didn't panic, didn't waste time. She grabbed her keys, slung her bag over her shoulder, and ran. The gym doors slammed shut behind her as her car roared to life. Back on the street, Laakia lay trembling, the phone still pressed in her small hand. The line open, her cries carrying across the city to the one person who would never abandon her. Her arm was bent, throbbing with a pain so intense she could hardly think. Each breath was a battle, each tear a release of agony. But she clung to the phone as if it were a lifeline. Because in truth, it was. The world around her seemed to fade. The trees blurred. The pavement beneath her seemed to tilt, and the sun that had once been warm now felt harsh and cruel. She whispered through her sobs, words that barely formed but still carried. "Mommy, it hurts. I didn't do anything." Her voice was so small, but it was enough. On the other end of the line, Ronda's grip on the steering wheel tightened until her palms ached. Every word from her daughter fueled the fire building inside her. The minutes dragged like hours. Laakia tried to stay awake, tried not to slip into the darkness that pain beckoned her toward. She remembered her mother's stories of fighters, of never giving up, of staying on your feet no matter how many times life tried to knock you down. She clung to those stories now, even as her body screamed for relief. She thought of the drawing that lay torn and dirty on the ground. She wanted to fix it, to show it to her mother. She wanted things to go back to how they had been only minutes before. The faint wail of sirens echoed in the distance, though Laakia couldn't tell if they were moving closer or further away. She prayed they were coming for her. Her tears blurred her vision as she turned her head slightly, the world tilting with the movement. She saw her apple in the gutter, its red skin dull now, like a reminder of something already lost. The sight made her cry harder, though she didn't know why. The sound of tires on pavement returned, different from before. An ambulance pulled up, its lights flashing, though the neighborhood was still strangely quiet. Neighbors peeked from windows but did not come out, as if fear had anchored them inside. Paramedics rushed to her, their hands careful but quick as they assessed her arm, their voices gentle but urgent. "She's in shock," one said. "Get her stabilized." Through it all, the phone never left her hand. Even as they lifted her onto a stretcher, even as the pain made her cry out, she clutched it tightly. The line was still open, still carrying her breaths, her sobs, to her mother racing down the freeway. Inside the ambulance, the paramedics worked swiftly. They secured her arm, offered her oxygen, checked her vitals. One of them noticed the phone in her hand, the call timer ticking away. "She's on the line with someone," he said softly. "Don't take it away." And so Laakia lay there, her arm bound, her face pale, her tears soaking the pillow beneath her, while her mother's voice filled the silence of the ambulance. Rhonda didn't ask questions. She didn't overwhelm her daughter with words. She spoke with the same calm strength she had always carried into the ring. "I hear you, baby. I'm coming. Hold on. I'm almost there." The ambulance lights painted the neighborhood in flashing red and white, a kaleidoscope of urgency and fear. The quiet town that had seemed so safe that morning now felt broken, the illusion shattered by one man's cruelty. But within that ambulance, amid the chaos, a bond stronger than any pain held firm, the bond between a child in need and a mother racing against time to protect her. The cry for help had been heard, and now nothing would stop what came next. The sirens split the air, but to Ronda Rousey, they were distant, swallowed by the pounding of her own heartbeat. She had driven like a woman possessed, weaving through traffic with a terrifying focus, the phone still on speaker beside her, as if tethered to her daughter's sobs by sheer will. The sound of Laakia's breathing, fragile and uneven, was the only thing that anchored her, the only sound that mattered. When she finally spotted the flashing lights ahead and the ambulance pulling into the emergency entrance of Wilmington General, she swung her car across 2 lanes and braked hard in front of the sliding glass doors. The gym bag and gloves in the back seat bounced with the sudden stop, but she barely noticed. She was already out of the car, running, her boots striking the pavement with a force that startled the staff waiting outside. Inside, the hospital was chaos in the way hospitals always were, with monitors beeping, nurses rushing between rooms, and patients in various states of pain and waiting. But when the stretcher carrying Laakia burst through the sliding doors, the frantic energy shifted. Doctors and nurses descended on the small figure immediately. Her tiny face was pale, her lips trembling as she clutched the phone in her good hand with desperate strength, refusing to let it go even when the paramedics tried to slip it away to place an IV. "I'm her mother," Rhonda's voice carried across the waiting room, cutting through the noise like a command. She shoved her way past 2 orderlies who instinctively tried to stop her. The intensity in her eyes was undeniable, and no one dared to argue. She reached the stretcher just as they wheeled Laakia into a treatment room. For a moment, she froze at the sight of her daughter's arm bent unnaturally, swollen already, her face streaked with tears. The fighter inside her, the part of her that had been trained to withstand pain, to keep her emotions locked behind a wall, cracked open. But she forced it down, because this was not about her. This was about the little girl on the table who needed calm more than panic. "I'm here, baby. I'm right here," she whispered, leaning close. Her hand brushed Laakia's damp hair back from her forehead, her eyes steady, her voice a rock against the storm. The nurses moved quickly, surrounding them. One prepared the IV while another called for x-rays. A third noted vitals, speaking in clipped medical shorthand that barely penetrated the haze of the moment. They worked with efficiency, but their eyes kept flicking to the child's small, trembling body and then to the mother standing unflinching at her side. Some of them recognized Ronda Rousey immediately. Her reputation had followed her even here, though never had her presence been so far removed from the octagon or a judo mat. She was not the fighter in this room, though she radiated the same strength. She was the mother of a broken little girl, and her fury was simmering just below the surface. The doctor on call, a wiry man with tired eyes, finally stepped in, holding up the first set of x-rays. "Compound fracture of the radius. Clean break," he said, glancing from the chart to Rhonda. "We'll need to set it, stabilize it, and then apply a temporary cast before she can go into surgery for a permanent fix. She'll be okay, but it will take time to heal. Rhonda's jaw tightened. The words were clinical, factual, but all she could see was her daughter's arm twisted by the grip of a man who had no right to touch her. She nodded once curtly, signaling she understood, though her eyes burned with a silent promise. The nurse who had been at the intake leaned closer to a colleague and whispered not quietly enough. They said police dropped her at the curb. No paperwork, no report. Just left her there. The words stabbed through the air. Rhonda's head snapped toward them. What did you say? Her voice was low, dangerous, controlled in the way only someone trained to harness their rage could manage. The nurse faltered, stammering, but finally repeated the story. The paramedics had said an officer had been involved, but no one left a badge number, no name, nothing but a discarded child. Rhonda inhaled deeply, every muscle in her body tense. She looked down at Laakea, who had begun to calm slightly as the sedatives dulled the sharp edge of her pain. The child still clung to the phone even in her haze, her fingers curled tightly around it as if refusing to let go of the lifeline that had brought her mother to her side. Rhonda gently pried it free, kissed her daughter's forehead, and tucked the device into her pocket. The call was still running. She ended it now, the connection no longer necessary because she was here. As the nurses worked, Rhonda stood at the foot of the bed, her arms crossed, her stance rooted. Memories flickered through her mind of every fight she had ever entered, every opponent she had faced. But never had she felt rage like this. The kind of rage that made the air feel too thin, the walls too close. She had faced champions, fighters at the peak of their ability, and she had never flinched. Yet here was her daughter, fragile and broken by a man who carried a badge meant to protect. She thought of the countless nights she had told Laakea bedtime stories, not of princesses or fairy tales, but of perseverance and courage, of getting up when the world knocked you down. And here was her child, knocked down in the cruelest way possible. If courage meant anything, if all those lessons had weight, then this moment demanded she act. The doctor cleared his throat, breaking into her storm of thought. We'll need you to wait outside while we set the arm. I'm not leaving her, Rhonda replied flatly. I understand, but... Her stare cut through him like a blade. He swallowed his protest and gave a slight nod to the nurse. Fine, one parent stays, but please stay out of the sterile area. She stepped back only enough to allow them space, but she never took her eyes off her daughter. Laakea whimpered once as they began the procedure, then drifted into a deeper sedated state. Rhonda's chest rose and fell with each of her daughter's breaths, as though she were drawing strength from them. When it was done, and the temporary brace secured, the room exhaled collectively. The nurse adjusted the monitor and then gently covered the girl with a blanket. She'll rest now, she said softly. She's safe. Safe. The word rang hollow in Rhonda's ears. Her daughter might be stabilized here, but safety was an illusion shattered by the very person sworn to uphold it. Rhonda's eyes hardened. She knew what came next. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was an assault, and she would not let it vanish into silence. Outside the treatment room, the hospital corridors buzzed with activity, but everywhere Rhonda walked, heads turned. Some recognized her. Others simply sensed the force of her presence. Her fists, scarred from years of training, clenched at her sides. She had spent her life fighting for titles, for respect, for her place in a brutal sport. But this fight, she knew, was bigger than all of them. This was for her daughter, and no referee would stop her before it was over. By the time she returned to the bedside, Laakea was asleep, her breathing steady now, her small hand resting against the blanket. Rhonda sat beside her, brushing her hair back gently, her face unreadable, but her heart ablaze. The quiet hum of machines filled the room, and for a brief moment, she allowed herself to simply be a mother again, to hold vigil over her daughter. But behind her calm exterior, a storm gathered, one that would not stop until justice had been delivered. The first shadow had struck, and now Rhonda was ready to answer. The hospital quieted as the night deepened, though inside the small room where Laakea slept, time felt suspended. The rhythmic beeping of the monitor and the steady rise and fall of the child's chest were the only signs that the world still moved forward. Rhonda had remained by her daughter's side long after the nurses dimmed the lights, her chair pulled so close to the bed that her arm brushed against the edge of the blanket. She barely moved, her body rigid and alert, even in the stillness, her eyes locked on Lakia's sleeping face. It would have been easy to sit there until dawn, pretending that the crisis ended with sedation and bandages. But the image of the officer's hand gripping her daughter's wrist haunted her. The knowledge that he was still out there, free and unaccountable, burned hotter than any injury she herself had ever sustained. She had lived her life in arenas where injustice was settled in minutes by strength and skill, where a referee ensured the rules were upheld. Here in this arena, there were no referees, only systems built to protect themselves. She knew that if she didn't act, the man who had broken her little girl's arm would disappear into paperwork and silence. When a nurse returned with paperwork to sign, Rhonda's eyes flicked to the forms. The official language, the boxes and codes, the words "incident unknown," scribbled into the space where an explanation should have been, it was all wrong. She signed what was necessary for Lakia's care, but her hand pressed the pen into the paper with such force it nearly tore through. Then she left the room quietly, the door shutting behind her with a soft click. The hallway stretched ahead, sterile and bright under humming fluorescent lights. Rhonda's boots echoed against the linoleum, the sound sharp in the emptiness. She found the intake desk where a young nurse sat typing notes into a computer. "I need the intake log from the ambulance that brought my daughter in," Rhonda said, her voice controlled but edged with steel. The nurse blinked, startled, but retrieved a clipboard. Rhonda scanned the form quickly, her eyes moving like a predator tracking a trail. The details were sparse, too sparse. No officer's name, no badge number, no incident report. Only the cryptic notation, Unit 73D, scrawled across one line. Almost as though whoever had written it had wanted to leave just enough to pass the burden on to someone else. Rhonda pulled out her phone and took a picture of the document. She didn't bother asking permission. She knew hesitation would only give the system time to lock her out. Then she walked out of the hospital into the cool night air. The street was quiet, the lamps casting halos of pale light on the asphalt. She leaned against the hood of her car for a moment, staring at the stars barely visible through the haze of city glow. Her mind sharpened. The fight was no longer theoretical. She had her first thread, and she would pull until the whole fabric unraveled. Her first call was to an old training partner who had since moved into private security. Within minutes, she had access to feeds of local traffic cameras. They rewound to the time when the officer's cruiser had slowed beside her daughter. The footage was grainy but enough. A tall man, his pale face visible through the window as he stepped out of the car. It wasn't yet a name, but it was an image, and images could be traced. The second call was to a journalist she trusted, someone who had once covered her fights, but who now specialized in stories of abuse of power. Rhonda sent the photo of the intake log and the clip from the traffic camera. "This happened to my daughter," she said flatly. The journalist was silent for a long moment before answering. "You know what you're starting, don't you?" Rhonda's reply was ice. "I'm starting the only fight that matters." As the hours passed, more information surfaced. Witnesses who had heard a scream on the street, a neighbor who admitted to seeing the cruiser but had been too frightened to intervene. Rumors of prior complaints against an officer whose name was whispered but never confirmed. Rhonda pieced them together like fragments of a puzzle, each one fitting into the outline of a pattern too familiar to ignore. By dawn, she had her name, Officer Ray Dunning. Badge number, assignment history, and most damning of all, a list of prior complaints, excessive force, misconduct, intimidation, that had all been dismissed quietly. The pieces fell into place with infuriating clarity. This wasn't a rogue accident. This was a man shielded by silence, allowed to continue until the day he crossed the wrong child. Her fist clenched as she stared at the file. The image of her daughter's arm bent unnaturally replayed in her mind, fueling a resolve so fierce it felt like fire in her veins. She opened her social media account and, without hesitation, posted the photo of Lakia's injured arm. She wrote in plain, cutting words, "My daughter was attacked by a police officer yesterday. His name is Ray Dunning. He broke her arm and left her on the street. This is what happens when silence protects abusers. I will not be silent. The reaction was immediate. Messages poured in, thousands of them within hours. Parents, activists, athletes, strangers who had never heard her name beyond the octagon, all rallied around her. Hashtags began to spread, calls for justice multiplied, and what had begun as a personal tragedy ignited into a public outcry. News outlets picked up the post, replaying the image of the child's broken arm on morning broadcasts. By midday outside the hospital, people began to gather with signs that read, "Justice for Laia and protect children, not abusers." Inside the hospital, Ronda remained calm on the surface. But inside, she was calculating her next move. The officer's face was in her mind like a target. But she knew this couldn't be a reckless fight. It had to be precise. It had to be undeniable. So she compiled everything she had gathered: photos, testimony, intake reports, camera footage, and sent it to a lawyer known for dismantling corrupt systems. "Build me a case," she said. As evening settled, Ronda returned to her daughter's side. Laia stirred, her eyes blinking open weakly, her lips parting as though to speak. Ronda leaned close, brushing her hair back gently. "You're safe now," she whispered. But even as she said the words, she knew safety was a fragile illusion. The man who had hurt her child was still free, still laughing perhaps, still hiding behind his badge. But not for long. The search was underway. The truth had begun to surface, and Ronda would not stop until it was dragged fully into the light. In her world, there was no retreat once a fight had started, and this was the only fight that mattered now. She sat in the darkened hospital room, with her daughter's hand resting in hers, her mind already moving to the next step. Tomorrow the real battle would begin. The hospital became a fortress of restless waiting, where every hour bled into the next, and every whispered voice in the hallway seemed to echo with speculation about what was coming. Outside, the crowd had grown larger. What had started as a handful of parents and neighbors holding handwritten signs had become a sea of faces, chanting together in rhythm, their voices carried by the wind into the sterile corridors of Wilmington General. Reporters circled the hospital entrance, their cameras ready to capture every glimpse of Ronda as she moved in and out of her daughter's room. The story was no longer just hers. It had become a public reckoning, and she could feel its weight pressing down on her with every step. Laia was still fragile, but the sedatives had worn off enough that she could sit up against the pillows. Her small body looked lost in the hospital bed, dwarfed by the sterile sheets and bulky machines. She asked in a whisper why the man had hurt her, and Ronda found herself unable to answer in simple words. How could she explain cruelty without reason to a child who had only ever known discipline as a path to growth, not as a weapon? Instead, she held her daughter close and told her that what happened was not her fault, that the world had people who wore uniforms they did not deserve, and that sometimes the bravest thing a person could do was to speak the truth even when it hurt. Laia nodded slowly, her eyes wide and thoughtful, as if she were already carrying a wisdom beyond her years. But even as she soothed her daughter, Ronda's mind burned with the knowledge that Ray Dunning was still out there. The pieces she had collected, the intake log, the camera footage, the testimonies were enough to paint a picture, but the department's silence confirmed what she already knew. They were hoping to bury this as they had buried so many complaints before. She felt the tension in her chest coil tighter with each evasive statement the police released to the press. Words like investigation and procedure rang hollow when weighed against the image of her daughter's broken arm. By the third day, whispers reached her through contacts inside the department that Dunning had not been formally suspended. He had not been stripped of his badge. He had simply been told to lay low. The rage that surged in her veins at this knowledge was white hot, but it was not uncontrolled. Years of fighting had taught her how to channel fury into precision. She would not lash out blindly. She would aim, strike, and dismantle. Late that evening, as the hospital quieted, and Laia finally drifted into an uneasy sleep, Ronda stood by the window of her daughter's room, staring down at the protesters lit by the glow of street lamps and television cameras. Their signs swayed in unison, their voices a chorus of defiance. She realized then that this was no longer about one child and one officer. This was about a system that had allowed men like Dunning to thrive in the shadows. And if he was protected by that system, then she would go directly through it to get to him. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Through a journalist friend, she learned that Dunning was not hiding as much as he should have been. He still frequented a small diner on the edge of town, Benny's Grill, every Sunday like clockwork. The arrogance of his routine, the audacity of acting as though nothing had happened, crystallized Ronda's decision. She didn't tell anyone her plan. Not the reporters, not the lawyers, not even the protesters outside. She only told her daughter that she would be back soon, and she pressed a kiss to her forehead as though sealing a vow. The diner smelled of grease and coffee, its neon sign buzzing faintly against the dark sky. Inside, the booths were worn, the vinyl cracked from years of use. The hum of conversation filled the air until the bell over the door rang. Heads turned as Ronda walked in, her presence commanding even among strangers. She was dressed simply, in jeans and a black jacket, but she carried herself with the unmistakable bearing of someone who could not be ignored. She spotted him immediately. Ray Dunning sat in his usual booth, his broad frame hunched over a plate of food, his phone in one hand. He laughed at something on the screen, oblivious to the shifting energy around him as people realized who had just entered. She walked toward him with steady steps, her eyes locked on her target. He looked up, his smirk faltering as recognition dawned. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice dripping with false bravado. Ronda didn't answer with words. She pulled out her phone and tapped the screen. The recording of La Kia's emergency call filled the diner, her daughter's voice trembling and begging, the sharp crack of bone breaking echoing like a gunshot. The room fell silent. Forks froze mid-air. Conversations died mid-sentence. Every face turned toward the booth where the officer sat. Dunning's smirk collapsed. His eyes darted around the room, searching for an ally but found none. The waitress who had served him stood rigid behind the counter, her face pale. Patrons shifted uncomfortably, their eyes full of judgment. "Where did you get that?" he muttered, his voice unsteady now. "You know who that girl is," Ronda said, her tone cold and unyielding. He swallowed hard. "Doesn't matter." She resisted. "She's my daughter," Ronda said, leaning forward, her eyes like steel. "And I am Ronda Rousey. You broke the wrong child." The weight of her words pressed down on the diner like a storm cloud. He shifted in his seat, his hand twitching as though considering reaching for something at his side, but the sharp intake of breath from the crowd warned him against it. Ronda slid a folded envelope across the table. Inside were copies of the intake report, the x-rays, the photos of bruises, and a draft of the lawsuit already prepared. "This is the end of your career," she said, her voice low enough that only he and those closest could hear, though the silence in the diner made every syllable carry. He sneered, trying to recover his bravado. "You threatening me? If I was threatening you, you'd already be on the floor," she said. Her fists rested on the table now, her knuckles pale but steady. The room seemed to hold its breath. Then she straightened, sliding the phone back into her pocket. "Next time I see you in uniform, I hope it's during your perp walk." With that, she turned and walked out, the bell above the door ringing once again, as though marking the end of a round. The whispers began the moment she left. The waitress picked up her phone and dialed the precinct. By the time Ronda returned to her car, her own phone buzzed with a message from a contact inside Internal Affairs. "He's finished. The recording is evidence. You've cornered him." Ronda sat in her car for a moment, staring at her reflection in the rearview mirror. Her daughter's face floated behind her eyes, fragile but unbroken. She tightened her grip on the steering wheel. This fight was not over. Confronting him was only the beginning. Now the system itself would be forced to answer. Outside, the night air was heavy, but her steps were lighter as she returned to the hospital. La Kea was still sleeping, her tiny hand curled around the edge of her blanket. Ronda sat beside her again, but now her resolve was sharper, her path clearer. She had faced the man who hurt her child and seen the fear in his eyes. The next step was to strip him of the power he had abused. The confrontation was done, but the war had only begun. The confrontation at the diner had been like striking a match in a dry field. The spark caught instantly, spreading from one set of eyes and ears to another, carried by whispers, amplified by phones, transformed into headlines before the night had even ended. By morning, the clip of Ronda Rousey confronting Ray Dunning had reached every major network. Though the audio was grainy, the recording of Laakea's terrified voice played alongside the image of her mother standing tall before the man who had tried to crush a child's spirit. It was undeniable, raw, and it spread like wildfire. Outside the hospital, the protest doubled in size. Signs appeared not only calling for justice for one child, but demanding accountability for every child who had been silenced before. Mothers brought their children, teachers brought their students, veterans marched beside activists. It was no longer a single story, it had become a movement. Inside the hospital room, the energy was quieter, but no less charged. Laakea sat propped up against her pillows, a brace protecting her healing arm, her eyes curious as she scrolled gently through messages of support on a borrowed tablet. She was too young to understand the full scope of what was happening, but she could sense it in the way her mother's phone never stopped buzzing, in the way nurses looked at them with both sympathy and respect, and in the way people outside chanted her name. She felt the world leaning toward her, lifting her voice in ways she had never imagined. Ronda stayed close, her presence a shield, her eyes sharp even in moments of stillness. She knew what was coming. The system would not surrender easily, and the fight would not end with a single confrontation in a diner. The true battle would be fought in the courtroom. When the day of the hearing arrived, the courthouse in Los Angeles brimmed with tension. Reporters jostled for space on the steps, protesters waved banners, and police officers stood rigid at the entrance, their faces betraying unease as they scanned the restless crowd. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with the anticipation of history about to unfold. The courtroom itself was packed to capacity, with families who had endured similar tragedies pressed shoulder to shoulder with journalists, lawyers, and citizens who had come to witness what they hoped would be the end of an era of silence. At the front, Ronda sat tall, her back straight, her hands clasped together. She wore no makeup, no jewelry, nothing to soften her presence. She was not here as a celebrity or a fighter, but as a mother seeking justice. Beside her, Laakea sat in her brace, her small face solemn, her wide eyes drinking in the gravity of the moment. She clutched a sketchbook on her lap, a new one her mother had given her, the pages already filled with drawings she had made during long hours of recovery. On her other side sat the lawyers, their folders stacked with evidence, their expressions set with determination. Across the aisle, Ray Dunning looked diminished. Gone was the swagger he carried into Benny's grill, gone the smirk that once shielded him with arrogance. He was paler now, thinner, his uniform replaced with a plain suit that seemed too large for him. His eyes rarely lifted, and when they did, they flickered with something that looked uncomfortably like fear. Behind him, his attorneys shuffled papers, their whispered voices carrying no conviction. The judge entered and the room rose. The proceedings began with the formality of any other trial, but the atmosphere carried the weight of something extraordinary. The prosecutor's opening words sliced through the silence. "We intend to prove that Officer Raymond Dunning knowingly and violently assaulted a minor, failed to report the incident, attempted to flee responsibility, and acted under the protection of a system that has allowed such abuses to persist unchecked." The gallery erupted in murmurs, silenced only by the judge's sharp rap of the gavel. Then came the evidence. The first piece was the emergency call itself. The courtroom froze as Laakea's trembling voice filled the air. "Please stop. That hurts. I didn't do anything." Then came the sound, the crack of breaking bone, that silenced even the most stoic faces in the room. One juror covered her mouth, another turned away, tears brimming in her eyes. The judge himself shifted uneasily, the sound echoing in the chambers like a haunting truth that could not be ignored. The X-rays were next, displayed on screens for all to see, showing the clean fracture of the child's arm. Photos of bruises and swelling followed, each one accompanied by medical testimony that confirmed the injuries were consistent with excessive force. Nurses spoke of how the child was left at the curb, abandoned without explanation. Paramedics confirmed that no officer remained to file a report. Piece by piece, the narrative unfolded, leaving no room for doubt. Then it was Ronda's turn. She walked to the stand with the same composure she carried into fights, but there was no triumph in her stride. She spoke plainly, recounting the moment she heard her daughter scream, the snap of bone, the panic that cut through her like a blade. She described the hospital intake, the missing records, the trail she followed to uncover the truth. Her voice was measured, controlled, but each word carried the weight of a fighter who knew how to strike with precision. When the defense tried to paint her as volatile, she leaned forward and answered with steel. "I didn't punch him because I lost control. I did it because he thought no one would ever hold him accountable." The objection that followed was overruled, and the words lingered in the air like a challenge. Finally, it was Lakia's turn. The courtroom held its breath as the little girl was led to the stand. She looked small in the chair, her feet not touching the ground, her brace visible beneath her dress. Yet when she spoke, her voice was clear, steady beyond her years. "He asked me for ID," she said, "but I'm 9. I told him my name. I told him my mom's name. He laughed. Then he grabbed me and twisted my arm. I heard it break." The gallery did not breathe. Even the reporters stopped typing, their fingers frozen over their keyboards. Then with quiet determination, she pulled a page from her sketchbook and held it up. It was a drawing of a little girl with her arm in a brace, standing tall before a crowd. Beneath it, in neat letters, were the words, "I'm stronger now." The silence broke not with applause, but with something heavier, more powerful, the collective sound of people rising to their feet. The gallery stood as one, not instructed, not prompted, but compelled by the courage of a child who refused to remain silent. Laakea looked at them, then at her mother, who nodded with pride, her eyes shining with restrained tears. The trial lasted 8 days, each one a relentless march of testimony and evidence. Former officers came forward, some with trembling voices, confessing that complaints against Dunning had been buried to protect the department. Parents spoke of children intimidated during stops. Teachers recalled students who had returned to class shaken and silent after encounters with the same officer. It was no longer the story of one man's violence, but of a system that had allowed his violence to fester. When the jury finally withdrew to deliberate, the air in the courthouse was taut with expectation. 6 hours later, they returned. At 4:11 p.m., the foreperson stood and delivered the verdict, guilty on all counts. Aggravated assault on a minor, abuse of authority, attempted evasion of justice. Each word landed like a hammer against the fragile armor of a man who had once believed himself untouchable. Dunning showed no emotion as he was cuffed and led away, his head bowed, his name now etched into history not as a servant of the law, but as its disgrace. The steps of the courthouse filled with applause as Ronda, Laakea, and their supporters emerged. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, but Ronda did not stop to answer. She walked with her daughter beside her, her arm around her shoulders, their steps in unison. Only when a voice called out above the chaos. "What happens now?" did she pause. She turned slightly, her face calm but unyielding. "Now," she said, "we build something that doesn't need a mother like me to be heard." Then she walked on, her daughter's small hand clasped firmly in her own. In the weeks that followed, they did not celebrate. They organized. The verdict was a victory, but it was only one in a long war. Ronda announced the launch of a nationwide initiative, a network of lawyers, investigators, and advocates committed to exposing patterns of abuse and protecting the vulnerable. Submissions poured in from every corner of the country, stories of silence broken, of wounds reopened, of people who had waited years for someone to listen. The work was heavy, but it was necessary, and for the first time, people believed change was possible. At home, Laakea returned slowly to her routines. She walked again to school, this time with her mother beside her. Neighbors watched from porches, some with tears, others with pride, as the two walked hand in hand down the same street where everything had changed. The girl's backpack bounced on her shoulders, her sketchbook tucked safely inside. She glanced up at her mother, her eyes shining with the resilience of someone who had faced the darkest shadow and come through stronger. And so the story that had begun with an ordinary walk home ended not with silence, but with a chorus of voices rising together. A child's cry had become a rallying call, a mother's fury had become a movement, and a broken arm had become the symbol of a new beginning. The fight was far from over, but it had begun in earnest, carried forward by those who refused to forget. by those who refuse to stay silent, and by the unshakable bond between a mother and her daughter. Don't miss what's coming next. Hit subscribe right now and join us on this journey. We've got even more unbelievable stories waiting for you in our next videos, so click through and keep watching. And if this story moved you, share it with your friends and family. Let everyone see what really happened.